Tonight, we are going to talk about something that sounds simple, but was anything but food. Specifically, what people ate in the Middle Ages, and why it so often ended in sickness, misery, or death. We tend to imagine medieval banquets with roasted boars, golden goblets, and tables groaning under the weight of bread and cheese. And yes, some nobles lived like that, for a few hours a week. But for most people, most of the time, food was not a feast. It was a slow, ongoing negotiation with hunger, rot, and hope. So before we dive in, settle down, dim the lights, and maybe get yourself a drink. Something safe, because after this, you might look at your kitchen very differently. Let's begin. The medieval world didn't have supermarkets or refrigerators. It had root cellars, salted meat, and very strong opinions about turnips. Most food was local, seasonal, and extremely perishable. And that meant people ate what was available, not what was ideal. In summer, you might enjoy berries, beans, and fresh bread. In winter, you had dried peas, hard cheese, and if you were lucky, a barrel of something that used to be fish. Bread was the foundation. Everyone ate it, from kings to shepherds. But not all bread was created equal. Rich people had white bread, soft and fluffy, made from finely ground wheat. Poor people had rye or barley bread, dense and sour, sometimes even mixed with things like acorns or pea flour when wheat ran low. And yes, some of those things made people sick. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, could cause hallucinations, vomiting, and even death. No one knew why. They just knew that sometimes the bread made people scream. Meat was another story. If you had land, livestock, or enough coin, you could enjoy pork, beef, or poultry. But even then, it wasn't fresh unless it was freshly killed. Most meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Preservation was key. A pig could feed a family for weeks, but only if it was carefully butchered, brined, and kept cool. And cool didn't mean a fridge. It meant a shaded spot, a stone cellar, or a barrel packed with salt. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Spoiled meat wasn't always obvious. There were no expiration dates. If it didn't smell too bad and wasn't crawling with something visible, it went into the pot. People added strong herbs, onions, garlic, and even vinegar to disguise the taste, not to improve the flavor, to survive it. Food poisoning wasn't rare. It was routine, and the symptoms weren't subtle. Fevers, sweats, violent purging. Sometimes people blamed it on bad spirits, sometimes on the cook. But no one suspected bacteria. Germs weren't discovered until centuries later. Meanwhile, bad food kept killing slowly and quietly. Fish was more common than meat in many places, especially near rivers or the coast. But again, freshness was an issue. Salted fish could last months, but it also tasted like a leather strap soaked in brine. Some people dried it so hard it had to be beaten with a hammer before cooking. Monks ate a lot of fish, not by choice, but by rule. Meat was often forbidden during fasting days, which added up to nearly half the year. So they got creative with eels, herring, and pike. And if it smelled off, well, prayer helped. Dairy was tricky. Milk spoiled fast, especially in summer. Cheese lasted longer, but only if aged and stored properly. Butter was precious, but also perishable. Many families churned it at home, hoping to stretch it as long as possible. Sour milk? You drank it. Moldy cheese? You scraped it. You used everything because you had to. Waste wasn't just frowned on. It was dangerous. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, not daily staples. If you had a garden, you might grow onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, and maybe a few herbs. Apples and pears grew in orchards, but ripe fruit didn't last. You could dry it, stew it, or turn it into something closer to jam. But fresh, that was a short-lived pleasure. In winter, people relied on pickled vegetables or root crops buried in sand. Nothing tasted crisp. Everything tasted like effort. And not all plants were safe. Some mushrooms were edible. Others were lethal. People didn't always know the difference. The same went for berries, leaves, and roots. Trial and error was often fatal. A salad could be deadly. A soup could send you to the priest. And still, people foraged, because food was life, and risk was part of it. Water was another quiet killer. Most of it wasn't clean. Wells could be tainted. Rivers carried waste. People dumped everything into the same streams they drank from. Boiling water was rare, not because they didn't know it helped, but because fuel was expensive. Wood had to be gathered, dried, and rationed. Fire was for cooking, not for purifying, so people drank what was available. Often, that meant beer. Small beer, as it was called, was weak, barely alcoholic, and brewed quickly, but it was safer than water. Even children drank it. Fermentation killed some of the nastier things in the liquid, and so beer became a daily drink, not a treat. The same was true for wine in warmer regions. Water was suspect. Alcohol was survival. Of course, the quality of food depended heavily on class. Nobles had access to game, spices, fresh fruit, and elaborate dishes. Peasants had pottage, a sort of stew made from grains, vegetables, and scraps of whatever could be found. It simmered all day in a single pot, growing thicker and stranger with each passing hour. The pot was rarely cleaned. It was safer that way. The pottage pot was the heart of many homes. It never truly emptied. Instead, ingredients were added over time. Oats, beans, bits of salted meat, maybe a bone for flavor. If a cabbage leaf was found, it went in. If the stew looked too thin, a handful of flour thickened it. Bread crusts, dried herbs, stale ale. It all became part of the mixture. Sometimes it tasted good. Sometimes it just kept you alive. People didn't eat by the clock. They ate when food was available. Breakfast might be a crust of bread and ale. Dinner was the main meal, often around midday. Supper, if it existed, was small and simple. There were no snacks, no casual bites. Every meal was a transaction with hunger, and hunger always wanted more. In lean times, famine arrived like a cold wind. Crops failed. Granaries emptied. Bread prices soared. People stretched their flour with sawdust, chalk, or ground bark. Yes, bark. It didn't nourish, but it filled the stomach, and sometimes that was enough. Until it wasn't. Malnutrition weakened the body. Diseases followed. Entire villages wasted away. And those who survived never forgot the taste of desperation. Food was not just fuel. It was deeply tied to belief. The church dictated what could be eaten, and when. Fasting days were numerous. Lent lasted weeks. Meat was restricted. Fat and indulgence were sins. People obeyed, mostly, but in private, rules bent. A rabbit became a fish if a clever monk said so, and swan, for reasons unclear, was often considered acceptable even when forbidden. Spices were rare and valuable. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, saffron. They came from faraway lands and cost a fortune. Nobles used them to show off wealth and mask the taste of aging meat. A dish laced with spice was a statement, not of flavor, but of power. For the poor, salt was the only seasoning, and even that could be hard to come by. Salt was life. It preserved meat, flavored porridge, and kept fish edible through long winters. Salt pans and salt mines were fiercely guarded. In some regions, salt was taxed heavily, turning a basic necessity into a symbol of control. To run out of salt wasn't just inconvenient. It meant your food would spoil faster, your meals would taste of nothing, and your chances of lasting through winter would shrink. Sweetness, on the other hand, was nearly mythical. Honey was the main source of sugar for centuries. Beekeeping was a respected skill, and honey was prized not only for its taste, but also for its supposed healing powers. People added it to cakes, mead, and rare fruit preserves. But it was precious, a gift for the church, a treasure for kings. Sugar, when it arrived, was exotic and expensive. The idea of sweetening food daily was unthinkable for most. Cooking tools were simple. Pots were made of clay or iron, often blackened by constant use. Ovens were rare. Open fires were common. Bread might be baked in communal ovens once a week, or simply cooked on hot stones. Spits turned slowly over coals. Wooden spoons stirred endlessly. There were no thermometers, no timers, just instinct, experience, and a bit of hope. Food was eaten from trenchers, flat, stale loaves of bread used as plates. After the meal, the bread could be eaten, given to the poor, or thrown to the dogs. Knives were shared. Forks were unusual. Fingers did most of the work. And people didn't dine alone. Meals were communal, noisy, and filled with the smells of smoke, sweat, and stew. Privacy was a luxury. Eating was a shared act of survival. Leftovers were rare. What wasn't eaten was saved, stretched, or repurposed. A pot of soup might feed a family twice. A loaf of bread could become crusts, crumbs, then thickener. Nothing went to waste. Even bones were boiled, scraped, and eventually fed to pigs or dogs. Waste was not just frowned upon. It was dangerous. It meant someone might go hungry tomorrow. Dining customs reflected class as much as the ingredients did. In noble halls, meals were events. Tables were long, covered in linen, and filled with many courses. Not all at once, but one after the other, brought in by servants. There were stews, pies, roasts, and sauces, each dish designed to impress, not just feed. But even in castles, hygiene was questionable. Dogs roamed under tables, bones were tossed aside, hands wiped on clothing, and perfumes did more work than soap. In peasant homes, the meal was simpler, a single pot, a shared bowl, maybe a hunk of bread to dip. People sat close, not out of affection, but out of necessity. The fire was small, the room was cold, and every bit of warmth, light, and food had to be used wisely. There were no dining rooms, no courses, just the hope that tomorrow's meal would come at all. Illness from food was common, but not always understood. A bad loaf might bring on fever. A spoiled chicken could lead to agony, but people didn't talk about bacteria. They spoke of bad air, curses, divine punishment, or spoiled humors. A swollen belly was not a symptom of botulism. It was a mystery, and sometimes a death sentence. Monasteries tried to control food in both quantity and spirit. Gluttony was a sin. Simplicity was praised. But even monks had kitchens, cellars, and cooks. Some orders became known for their beer, others for their cheeses. Fasting didn't always mean starving. It meant different rules. Fish instead of meat, soup instead of bread, and every change was accompanied by ritual. Travelers faced special challenges. Roads were dangerous, inns expensive, and food uncertain. Bread bought from a village oven might be clean, or it might carry mold. A stew from an inn could be fresh, or it could be yesterday's scraps boiled again. People relied on dried meat, hard cheese, and flatbread, not for taste, for survival, because bad food could ruin more than a meal. It could ruin the journey. Markets were the lifeblood of food supply in towns. Once or twice a week, people gathered to buy and trade baskets of eggs, bundles of herbs, wheels of cheese, and loaves of bread passed from hand to hand. Fishmongers shouted prices. Bakers sold yesterday's crusts for a discount. The wealthier buyers arrived early. The poor waited until the end, hoping for bargains. And always, the smells told their own story. Some fresh, some foul, all unavoidable. Food was taxed, inspected, and sometimes faked. Bread might be padded with chalk to add weight. Wine could be thinned with water or sweetened with honey past its prime. Cheating was common, punishment rare. The line between clever and criminal was thin. Sellers needed coin, buyers needed calories, and truth was often optional. Some foods were tied to superstition. Garlic was said to ward off evil. Onions were believed to cure illness. Bread baked with a prayer might protect a household. And on feast days, special dishes were made not just for taste, but for blessing. Eggs dyed for spring, cakes with coins inside, honeyed nuts on winter nights. These weren't luxuries. They were rituals, a way to make sense of a world where hunger waited outside every door. Food could also be a punishment. Prisoners lived on crusts and water. Servants who stole food might be flogged. During famines, hoarders were despised. A person caught selling bread above price might be shamed in public. A butcher who sold spoiled meat could be driven from the market. But justice was inconsistent. the powerful ate, the weak endured, and food, like everything else, followed the rules of power. In some places, famines were remembered in stories, not just as disasters, but as markers of time. The year of empty fields, the winter without grain, the summer of sour milk. These names meant something. They carried weight, and they reminded people that survival was never guaranteed, that the land could betray, that a full stomach was a gift, not a right. Children learned early that food was not to be wasted. Crumbs were gathered, broth was sipped to the last drop, and bones were saved. Even ashes from the hearth had their place, sometimes used in soap, sometimes in bread ovens to retain heat. Nothing was thrown out lightly. To waste food was to tempt fate, and no one tempted fate more than once. Holidays changed the rhythm. Religious festivals brought rare treats. A goose roasted for Michaelmas, spiced bread at Christmas, eggs at Easter. These moments stood out, not for extravagance, but for contrast. A sweet pastry after weeks of bland porridge felt like a miracle. A fruit pie in autumn was more than dessert. It was proof that the harvest had come. But not every harvest was kind. Crops failed often. Rain spoiled the grain. Frost ruined the roots. Rats and insects did the rest. When this happened across a wide region, the result was famine. And famine didn't just kill, it changed people. Parents skipped meals for their children. Neighbors turned silent. People sold tools, clothes, even their homes for a bag of flour, and still, the hunger grew. In cities, the problem was worse. More mouths, less land. Grain had to be brought in. If the roads were blocked or the merchants greedy, bread disappeared. The poor rioted. Bakers hid. Guards were posted at ovens, and even then, rumors spread that someone was hoarding flour, that rats carried the disease, that the bread was cursed. Diseases and food were deeply connected. No one understood germs, but everyone understood patterns. When meat spoiled, people got sick. When the grain went black, people raved. Bread made from bad rye could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. They called it St. Anthony's fire. No one knew it was ergot. They just knew the bread burned them from the inside out. Yet still, people ate, because hunger was louder than fear, because not eating meant weakness, and weakness meant death. So they chewed, swallowed, prayed, and hoped that this meal would be safe, that the bread was clean, that the meat was fresh, and that tomorrow there would be more. Monks kept records, and in those records were lists of food: lentils, barley, cheese, fish, ale, but also complaints about spoiled stores, moldy bread, dried meat too tough to chew. Even in the calm of a monastery, food was never guaranteed. Cellars flooded. Rats chewed through sacks. The grain beetles came without invitation, and the brothers prayed, not just for souls, but for survival. Preservation methods were both clever and desperate. Smoking, drying, pickling, salting, storing in fat. But each method had its limits. A smoked sausage hung too long could go hard as wood. A pickled onion left too warm could fizz and rot. Even salted fish, packed tightly in barrels, could turn. And no one knew why, only that it smelled wrong, and that eating it might mean fever or worse. Ice was a dream. In colder regions, people stored snow in underground pits, covered with straw. But even then, it melted by spring. There were no freezers, no coolers, just hope and stone walls. And hope, while powerful, did not stop meat from spoiling. The best defense was speed. Eat it fast, share it, stew it, stretch it, but never delay. The rich insulated themselves with layers of options. If the beef was bad, they had veal. If the bread was moldy, they had pies. If the fruit was sour, they had candied peels in jars from the south. But even they were not immune. Feasts ended in sickness. Guests collapsed. A nobleman's kitchen could be grand, but his belly was still human. Travelers told stories of distant lands with strange foods. Spices that cured illness. Roots that gave strength. Grains that never spoiled. Most of it was myth, but people listened, because the idea of safe food was powerful, magical even. A fruit that didn't rot, a meal that didn't kill. It sounded like a gift from the heavens, and so they experimented, dried flowers in wine, burned herbs in fire pits, fed chickens certain seeds to change the taste of eggs. Some ideas worked, others didn't. But trying was part of survival, and belief, however strange, helped people feel like they had a little control in a world where dinner could be deadly. Animals were part of the food chain, but not always the way people imagined. Chickens laid eggs, yes, but only when they weren't stressed, sick, or eaten by foxes. Pigs were valuable, but needed feeding. And feeding a pig during famine could feel like feeding hope to a whole. Cows gave milk, but only if healthy, and healthy was rare. Sheep gave wool first, then meat. Goats were tough, noisy, and useful. But even animals fell victim to disease, theft, or weather. Killing an animal was a decision. It meant one less source of food tomorrow, in exchange for food today. A pig might be raised for months only to be slaughtered before winter. The whole village might take part. Blood was caught, organs cleaned, fat rendered. Nothing wasted, but the meat had to be preserved quickly. Salted, smoked, buried in ash, or hung in the cold. Otherwise, it turned. And turned meat meant death. Food theft was serious. A stolen chicken could lead to a whipping. A missing sack of grain could bring exile. Hunger made people cruel. It also made them clever. False bottoms in baskets. Carts with hidden compartments. A loaf baked with pebbles inside to add weight. Punishment varied by place and power, but everywhere, food was worth more than honesty. Cooking was dangerous. Open flames, boiling pots, smoke-filled rooms. Burns were common. So were cuts. A cook with steady hands and a quiet mind was prized. Recipes weren't written. They were memorized, passed down, or guessed. Measurements were rough. A pinch, a handful, a boil until it smells right. And still, food sometimes killed. And yet, meals were sacred. not because they were grand, but because they happened at all. A shared loaf, a warm bowl, a full stomach. These things were celebrated. Prayers were whispered before eating, not out of habit, but out of genuine thanks. Thanks that the bread had risen, the stew hadn't spoiled, the water hadn't made anyone sick, because in the medieval world, food was never just food. It was risk. It was memory. It was life measured one bite at a time. In times of scarcity, people turned to what they called famine foods. Things no one touched unless they had to. Grass boiled into mush, bark ground into flour, moss scraped from stones, even the skins of animals soaked and boiled into gelatin. These were not meals. They were survival attempts. And sometimes they worked. Other times they only stretched the suffering. Some tried eating clay, believing it would fill the belly. It did, for a moment. Then came cramps, vomiting, and sometimes death. Hunger clouded judgment. People foraged desperately, pulling up plants with names they didn't know, boiling roots that had never been cooked before. One wrong guess, and the pot became poison. Children suffered most. They had smaller bodies, weaker resistance. During famines, they wasted quickly. Bellies swelled, eyes dulled, cries faded into silence. Mothers gave away their food, then their jewelry, then their dignity, all for one more mouthful. Stories of desperate families eating shoe leather or boiled parchment were not exaggerations. They were memories, passed down, whispered, never forgotten. Rituals formed around food, blessings before meals, superstitions about salt spilled on the ground. Bread was never cut on certain days. Meat was not shared during storms. Eggs left under the bed were said to cure illness. People didn't believe blindly. They believed carefully, because belief was sometimes the only tool left. Weddings had food. Funerals had food. Feasts marked births, harvests, and holy days. Even executions drew crowds with promises of bread and drink. Food bound people together, not just through hunger, but through time. A pie at a festival meant more than sweetness. It meant survival had been achieved, if only for a day. Some kept food hidden, a crust in a pocket, dried fruit in a jar buried under the floor. Not from greed, from fear. The fear that tomorrow's table might be empty, that the stew might be thin, that the cupboard might echo. People lived with this fear so long, it became part of them, as natural as breath. And still, they went on, ate what they had, shared what they could, hoped for more. Preserved fruits were a quiet treasure. Apples sliced thin and dried in the sun. Pears stewed with a hint of honey. Plums boiled down into dark, sticky paste. These weren't everyday foods. They were kept for cold months, for guests, or for rare moments of joy. A spoonful could brighten a bleak evening, but only if stored properly. Mice, mold, and moisture could take everything in a single night. Grain was currency. It paid rent, bought favors, filled bellies. But grain had enemies. Dampness turned it rancid. Rats chewed through sacks. Moths laid eggs. A barn full of grain might seem like wealth, but it had to be watched constantly. A careless week could mean ruin, and no one pitied a ruined granary. Bakers held real power. They fed towns, but their ovens burned hot and fast, and mistakes were punished. Burned bread, underweight loaves, or shortcuts could bring fines. In some places, bakers were required to mark each loaf with a personal stamp. That way, if someone grew ill, they knew who to blame. It was both protection and threat. Millers, too, were watched closely. They ground the grain. They controlled the flow. A dishonest miller could take more than his share. So towns posted rules, measured sacks, required witnesses. And still, trust was fragile. A hungry customer looked twice at every scoop, and a good miller stayed quiet and careful. Oats and barley were staples for many. Porridge in the morning, bread in the evening, stews at night. Oats were forgiving. They stored well, cooked quickly, and filled the belly. Barley was tougher but dependable. Wheat was the prize, soft and white, but harder to grow. Only the wealthy had it often. The rest made do. In fishing villages, the sea fed everyone. Salted cod, dried herring, pickled eel. Nets were cast daily. Smokehouses ran constantly. The smell of brine and fish guts filled the air. Not pleasant, but familiar. And in good years, there was enough to trade inland. In bad years, the ocean turned empty. Nets came back light. Fires burned low, and prayers rose with the tide. Inland villages relied on what they could grow and what they could trade. Chickens for eggs, goats for milk, a few pigs if they were lucky. A garden might hold leeks, onions, cabbage, and herbs. The soil decided everything. A rocky patch meant bitter roots. A sunny slope meant better carrots, and no one planted without watching the sky. Droughts were feared more than war. No rain meant no crop. No crop meant hunger. A week of heat could undo a season's work, and once the fields cracked and the wells ran low, people started to count everything. Loaves, sacks, spoonfuls. Hope shrank like a dry river, and still, they waited for clouds. When rain finally came, it was not always kind. Too much, too fast, and fields turned to mud. Seeds drowned. Mold grew. The line between enough and ruin was thin, and the land never promised balance. It gave and it took, without apology. Some villages had apple trees. Others had vines. Wine was a gift and a gamble. A good harvest brought barrels of tart, lively drink. A bad one brought sour liquid that barely passed as vinegar. But people drank it anyway, because clean water was rare, because wine lifted spirits, because even a bitter mouthful was better than none. Cooking changed with the seasons. In summer, there were fresh things, berries, peas, herbs. In winter, it was all stewed, salted, and boiled. Bread baked less often. Fires were used carefully. Wood had to last. And the cold turned food into something precious. A bowl of soup became warmth itself. Children learned early to recognize plants. Which leaves could be eaten. Which mushrooms must be left alone. They were taught by watching, tasting, and sometimes mourning. A mistake in the woods could mean a quiet burial under frost-covered soil. But knowing what to eat wasn't just useful. It was survival education, a skill passed through hands and whispers. There were no cookbooks for the poor. Recipes lived in memory. Measurements were done by eye. A stew made last week might taste different today, and that was fine. No one expected consistency, only nourishment, only safety, only a full belly and one more day. Not all meals were shared equally. In manners, the Lord ate first, then his household, then the servants. Scraps were passed down, growing colder, smaller, and more picked over with each step. At the very bottom were the laborers, who waited and hoped that something would remain. Often, they brought their own food anyway. Hard bread, cold beans, maybe a bit of fat wrapped in cloth. Food wasn't only about hunger. It marked your place. What you ate, how you ate, and where you sat said everything. A noble with a silver spoon and a dozen courses was seen as favored by God. A peasant with one bowl and no meat was simply normal. That was the world's order. Changing it was dangerous. Questioning it was worse. Still, people dreamed of feasts, of soft bread, of sweet fruit in winter. The tales they told at night were full of magical meals, tables that refilled themselves, fountains of honey, banquets where no one ever went hungry. These weren't just fantasies. They were expressions of longing, a way to cope with the gnawing edge of reality. Some claimed they had seen such things. A hidden village with endless grain. A forest glade where deer walked into your arms. A monk who could bless a single fish into feeding 50. Maybe none of it was true. Maybe all of it was. In times of need, truth bent like a dry branch, and belief, however thin, gave strength. In towns, taverns filled bellies and loosened tongues. Ale flowed. Bread was served with salt or cheese. A pot of stew bubbled behind the counter. It might be fresh. It might be days old. But it was hot. And hot food forgave many sins. Travelers shared benches with locals. News traveled faster than carts. And in the haze of smoke and hunger, stories became currency. No one expected luxury. Just enough. Enough to quiet the stomach. Enough to sleep through the night. Enough to wake and start again. For many, that was the only goal. Eat, work, sleep, repeat. And in between, hold on to the small pleasures. A warm cup, a ripe apple, a crust not yet hard. Because in the end, food was never just about fullness. It was about endurance, a quiet form of faith. Feeding a family took more than food. It took planning. A loaf couldn't be eaten all at once. A slab of bacon had to last a week. Mothers learned to stretch ingredients. A handful of beans, a turnip, and a pinch of salt became soup. Leftovers from one day became the base of the next. Hunger taught creativity, and waste was never an option. Children were fed last, not out of cruelty, but because their needs were different. Adults needed strength for work. Children learned patience. The smallest ones might get broth or porridge, thinned until it was more liquid than grain. A good year meant fruit. A bad year meant stories. Tales to distract from empty bowls. Some homes had gardens, not formal rows, but patches of soil carved beside the door or near the fence. Cabbage, leeks, garlic, and herbs. These little plots were lifelines. A single onion could flavor a week's worth of meals. A patch of mint might hide the sour taste of old meat. The earth, if tended, gave something back, but not always. Floods washed seeds away. Insects devoured leaves overnight. Frost came early or late. And sometimes nothing grew at all. That was the worst. Not famine from war or trade collapse, but silence from the soil. A kind of betrayal. The earth, once trusted, suddenly turned indifferent. In towns, people without land relied on markets. Butchers, bakers, brewers. Each had their stall, and each had a reputation. Some were known for fair portions, others for quick hands and heavy thumbs. A good baker had steady customers, a bad one heard whispers, and the market itself had rules. Weights were watched, prices posted, but rules only mattered when someone enforced them. For the sick, food was medicine or threat, broths for fevers, wine for pain, honey and vinegar for wounds. Some believed that certain foods caused illness, that cucumbers brought chills, that apples gave cough, that undercooked bread made the mind wander. Whether true or not, people listened. They couldn't afford to ignore a warning, even if it came from a neighbor with no teeth and a suspicious limp. Food was also offered to the dead. At funerals, bread and ale were shared among mourners. Sometimes a plate was left at the grave, not out of superstition, but out of respect. A final gesture, a reminder that even in death, the bond of hunger and comfort remained. The living needed closure, the dead a blessing. Superstitions touched every part of the meal. Salt spilled on the floor meant an argument was coming. Cutting bread unevenly meant a visitor would arrive. Stirring a pot counterclockwise might call in bad luck. No one knew where these beliefs came from, but no one challenged them, not in a world where so much depended on chance. In winter, meals grew darker and heavier. Turnips, onions, dried peas, everything boiled, everything softened. The cold made people quieter, tables closer. A hot meal could change the mood of a household. One pot steaming in the center of a small room made the world feel bearable, even if it was thin, even if it tasted of smoke. In summer, food came in bursts. Berries ripened fast, greens sprouted, then wilted. Milk soured more quickly, meat spoiled faster, but everything tasted stronger. Sunlight clung to vegetables. Fruits stained fingers, and the brief window of abundance reminded people that the world wasn't always cruel. Just often, the rich held banquets, roasted swans, gilded pies, sculpted sugar, not to satisfy hunger, but to show power. The dishes weren't always edible. Some were barely food. Meat dyed with saffron, bread carved into towers, but that was the point. To waste was to dominate, to display enough food to feed a village, then throw it away, was a message, a silent one, but understood by all. The poor heard of these things, saw glimpses through gates, smelled the spices drifting over stone walls. but it didn't anger them as much as one might think. Envy existed, but also resignation. That was the order of things. Some dined with silver, others with wood. Some fed dogs scraps finer than what others gave their children. And still, everyone ate with hands, with mouths, with hunger. Food theft increased in times of hardship. Not bold robberies, but quiet hands. A missing loaf from the oven's edge, a rabbit gone from the snare, a scoop of grain that vanished overnight. People noticed. They always noticed. But punishment was not always equal. A hungry child might be forgiven. A grown man might be whipped. Fairness was not promised. Punishments for stealing food were often public. Stocks in the square. A mark burned onto the hand. A shameful walk through the village. Not to protect food, but to protect order. Hunger made people desperate. Desperation made them brave, and too much bravery threatened those who still had something left. Beggars were part of every town. Some old, some sick, some simply broken by time. They waited outside churches, near bakeries, at the market's edge, holding out hands, whispering prayers. Sometimes they were fed. Other times, kicked aside. The line between mercy and dismissal was thin. People gave when they could, looked away when they couldn't. Churches offered food to the poor, but it was limited. A bowl of broth, a piece of bread. Enough to survive, not enough to rest. Feasts were shared on holy days, when charity was expected. But hunger didn't follow a calendar. It arrived whenever it pleased, and often it stayed. Monks grew food for themselves, but they also fed those who knocked. A handful of grain, a hunk of cheese, a few dried apples. Enough to get someone to the next village, enough to avoid turning a hungry man into a thief. Hospitality wasn't kindness. It was safety. Fewer enemies. Fewer crimes. Even in war, food played a role. Armies marched on stolen grain, burned fields, poisoned wells. Sieges weren't just battles. They were slow starvations. Walls didn't fall to swords. They fell to empty bellies. Cities surrendered not from fear, but from thirst, from cold, from the sound of children crying for bread that wasn't there, and when peace returned, food came slowly. Fields had to be cleared, seeds planted, trust rebuilt. It was always the same. Hunger came fast. Recovery came slow, and in the gap between them, people learned how much a single crust could mean. Some foods were forbidden, not by law, but by belief. Horses were rarely eaten, except in desperation. Dogs and cats were companions or workers, not meals. And yet, during famine, even those lines blurred. There were quiet moments in back alleys, meat stripped in silence, bones buried quickly, and then silence, again. Birds were common fare, chickens, geese, ducks, easy to keep, quicker to butcher. Their eggs were treasures, but their bodies fed many, roasted, stewed, salted, feathers plucked and saved for pillows, bones boiled into broth. Nothing wasted, not out of thrift, out of necessity. Pies were used to hide things, not secrets, but scraps. A crust of fat and flour held together meat that had lost its freshness. Vegetables near spoiling, Spices used more to mask than enhance. To eat a pie was to gamble. But if it was hot and the crust crisp, few questioned what lay inside. Fermented foods filled cellars and shelves. Cabbage turned to sauerkraut, milk into cheese, fruit into vinegar. These transformations were half science, half superstition. A clean jar, a cool corner, a tight seal, and still, some went wrong. A spoiled batch smelled of death. A good one, of survival. Ale was brewed in homes, small beer for daily use, stronger ales for guests, weddings, harvests. It was safer than water, easier than wine, and filling in a way that broth wasn't. Brewing was both craft and care. The wrong temperature, the wrong grain, and the result could make a man sick or worse. Honey was prized. Beekeepers were respected. A hive meant sweetness, wax, trade. But hives were hard to keep. Bears, storms, and mold all threatened the yield. Still, a spoon of honey in winter was gold. Mixed with herbs, it became medicine. Spread on bread, it became memory. Preserving food was work. Drying, salting, burying in ashes, packing in jars. Each method passed down, tested, improved. But even the best preparations could fail. A storm could flood the cellar. A rat could chew through the sack. Mold could creep overnight. And then, months of planning turned into a single spoiled smell. Seasons controlled everything. Spring meant planting and the last of the winter stores. Summer brought hope and green shoots. Autumn gave grain, fruit, and one last burst of life. Winter was the test, the long wait, the counting of sacks, the measuring of salt, the silence after supper when the bowl was scraped clean and still not quite enough. In some homes, meals became smaller as winter dragged on. Bread slices thinner, broth stretched with water, the last onion saved for a holiday. And yet, people didn't always despair. They told stories around the fire, sang songs, made jokes about chewing slowly to fool the stomach. Laughter didn't fill the belly, but it helped pass the time. When someone died, their food was shared. A pie left uneaten, a sack of grain divided among neighbors. Death gave nothing, but it loosened hands. And food, once hoarded, found new mouths. The living moved forward. The dead were remembered not with statues, but with stews and loaves, eaten slowly and with thought. Harvest festivals were the opposite. Loud, full, brief. Bread baked in great ovens. Meat roasted over flames. Apples dipped in honey. Children chasing each other through fields that had finally yielded. For a few days, food was everywhere. And then, just as quickly, it was rationed again. Stored, counted, protected. Towns had grain stores for emergency use, but they weren't always full. And they weren't always shared. Corruption was as old as hunger. A locked door. A quiet shipment in the night. A guard who looked away for coin, and when the need grew desperate, riots began not with swords, but with empty bowls held high. The wise knew how to stretch food. A stew made in layers. Grain at the bottom. Then vegetables. Then meat, if any, bread placed over the bowl to catch the steam. Nothing wasted. Even the steam was food, even the smell. And when everything ran out, there was still water, sometimes hot, to fool the mouth, sometimes cold, to quiet the stomach. And when even that was gone, there was prayer, not always to be answered, but always to be heard. Not every illness came from spoiled food, but many did, and no one could prove it. A child fell sick after a feast. Maybe it was the lamb, maybe it was fate. A traveler died after eating stew. Perhaps the meat was too old, or perhaps his time had simply come. Cause and effect blurred in a world without answers. Herbalists tried to help. They brewed teas, crushed leaves, burned roots. Some remedies worked. Others made things worse. Garlic for the blood, mint for the belly, honey for wounds. But for poisoning, there was little hope. Once the sickness took hold, it ran fast, and when death came, it was often quiet, heavy, and full of confusion. The word poison frightened people, but it also fascinated them. Some whispered of powders that killed without taste, liquids that slid into wine unnoticed, leaves that could take a man's strength within hours. Most had never seen such things, but the fear lingered, enough that every bitter bite raised suspicion. Food tasters existed, though mostly in noble houses. A servant ate first, watched closely. If they survived, the Lord followed. It wasn't a perfect system. Slow poisons fooled everyone, but it gave a sense of control, a way to face each meal without dread. For most, control came through habit, cooking what was familiar, avoiding what had caused sickness before, watching the fire, tasting cautiously, smelling the meat twice, scraping mold from cheese, trusting what the elders trusted, and praying for a strong stomach. Rats were constant companions, in barns, under floorboards, near food stores. Traps helped, but not much. Cats were better, though not always enough. A single rat could ruin a sack of grain in a night, and when they came in numbers, they brought more than hunger. They brought disease. Cleanliness was rare. Ashes scrubbed pots. Cloth wiped hands. But bacteria didn't care about ashes, and cloth didn't kill germs. No one knew what caused the fever that took 3 children in 1 week. They only knew it came after a new batch of bread. Still, they ate, because not eating was the greater danger, because hope, however thin, was better than an empty bowl. Food shaped memory. People didn't just recall faces or places. They remembered meals. The bitter soup during the long winter. The sweet bread on a wedding day. The roast shared after a birth. Each dish marked a moment. A sign that life had changed, or that it had simply gone on. Weddings were as much about food as vows. Families gathered. Tables were filled. Ale flowed. Bread baked in special shapes. Meat roasted with herbs saved for months. It was a celebration not just of union, but of survival. 2 people joining meant more mouths. Yes, but also more hands to cook, to plant, to share. Births were quieter. A bowl of broth for the mother. Honey, if it was available. Visitors brought eggs or a slab of cheese. Small gifts, given with care. The newborn had no idea, of course. But the food helped everyone else believe in life again. That something good had begun. Death, too, brought food. A final loaf. A pot of soup for the mourners. No one went hungry at a funeral if the family could help it. Because eating meant remembering. Because silence needed filling. Because grief was easier to bear with a piece of warm bread in hand. Seasons were tasted more than seen. Spring in the crunch of radish. Summer in the juice of a plum. Autumn in thick soups and wood smoke. Winter in dry bread and cold cheese. The year moved not through dates, but through flavor, through what the pot held, through what was missing, and sometimes food brought peace. A dispute over land paused for a shared drink. A fight ended with a loaf handed quietly across a table. Even the hardest men softened after a meal. Not because hunger made them kind, but because eating reminded them they were still human. Travelers carried food in cloth wraps, in pouches, tucked in sleeves. Dried meat, flat bread, hard cheese. Things that would last, or at least try to. A generous host offered something warm, a guarded one offered nothing. And every offer, big or small, meant something. It meant trust, or fear, or respect. Because in the medieval world, food was never just about feeding the body. It was about connection, to time, to place, to each other. Markets were not just for buying and selling. They were places of sound and smell. Baskets of apples beside salted fish. Wheels of cheese sweating in the sun. A butcher calling out prices beside a woman grinding grain. The scent of smoke, sweat, herbs and meat mixed into something sharp and unforgettable. Barter was common. A handful of eggs for a wedge of bread. A jar of honey for a bundle of leeks. Coins mattered, but trade survived when coin didn't. Trust was currency, too. A baker who gave credit. A farmer who delivered what he promised. A name that meant something in a world without ledgers. Spoilage was accepted. Some rot was scraped away. Some smells ignored. Cheese with blue edges could still be eaten. Bread that had hardened could be softened in broth. Nothing was perfect. No one expected it to be. If the core was good, the rest could be worked around. Children learned to chew slowly, not from politeness, but from caution. A bone in stew, a bitter root in porridge, a seed in a berry. Every bite was watched, every bowl finished, because food wasn't a given. It was a privilege, one often earned by someone else's hands. Cooking fires were constant, even in summer, even when the smoke made the eyes sting. A pot had to stay warm. A meal had to be ready. Neighbors could arrive without warning. A relative could pass through. A sick man could knock at the door, and no one was turned away without something, even if it was just crusts. Those crusts had meaning. Crusts left at a doorstep could mean sorrow. A basket of onions might mean apology. A jug of ale meant thanks. Words mattered. But so did what came with them. A man who asked for forgiveness with nothing in hand often found none. Hunger sharpened memory. People remembered who had helped, who had shared during the bad season. who had kept a store hidden, who had lied about what was left. Forgiveness was possible, but it came slowly, like dough rising in a cold room, heavy, hesitant. And so, food moved with people, in stories, in silence, in symbols. It filled the empty spaces they didn't know how to name. Some foods brought comfort beyond hunger, warm porridge on a cold morning, fresh bread when the scent filled the home, a thick stew after rain. These were not luxuries. They were reminders that the day had begun, that the fire still burned, that the body could be trusted, at least for now. The elderly ate slowly, not just from age, but from habit. They savored what remained, took small bites, chewed until nothing was wasted. They spoke of past meals, old recipes, lost ingredients, of apples that no longer grew, of pies once made with hands that were now dust. Their stories folded into every bowl. Children, in turn, listened, not always closely, but something remained, a phrase, a flavor, a warning. Never eat mushrooms with a cracked stem. Always boil beans twice. Bread made with silence tastes better. Not rules, but rhythms, passed through time like songs with missing verses. Food touched faith. Certain meals were eaten before holy days. Others were forbidden during fasts. Not just meat, but indulgence, richness, sweetness. Even in prayer, hunger played a role. Monks who ate only once a day. Pilgrims who lived on crusts. Fasting wasn't about absence. It was about focus. Bread was blessed. Wine shared. Feasts marked the return of saints. And even the poor found something to offer. A single egg, a few berries, a promise that faith mattered more than fullness, not because they didn't want to eat, but because some hungers couldn't be satisfied at the table. In hard years, people planted more herbs, not just for flavor, but for health. Dill for cramps, sage for sore throats, thyme for cuts. They didn't understand the science, but they watched and remembered what helped, what hurt, what healed. Some kept dried herbs in cloth pouches, hung above doors, buried in corners, worn on belts, not always used, but never far away, because illness came fast. And a bitter tea was better than nothing. Food was memory, medicine, comfort, control. In a world full of uncertainty, it was the one thing people could hold, prepare, share, a way to face the unknown, with something warm in their hands. Cooking tools were few. A pot, a knife, a wooden spoon, maybe a pan if the house was lucky. Iron was heavy and expensive. Clay broke easily. Wood burned if left too close to the fire, and yet people made meals, not grand ones, but steady ones, enough to feed, enough to last. Fires were not constant flames. They were embers tended with care. A good cook knew how to keep heat alive without wasting wood. Some meals were started at dawn and eaten at dusk. Others were cooked quickly, using whatever fuel remained. Ash was not failure. It was part of the process. Bread was often made in communal ovens. Villages shared space, heat, time, Each family brought their own dough, marked with a sign or symbol, carved or pressed into the top, so it would not be confused, so it would not be stolen. Waiting by the oven was quiet. No one spoke much, only watched the smoke and counted the minutes. Meals were rarely silent, though. People talked while they ate, about the day, the weather, the future. They argued, too, about salt, about portions, about who had taken more, but eating together meant something. Even if the food was poor, even if the fire smoked, even if the meat was tough, a lone meal, taken in silence, was a different thing. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes shameful. It depended on the reason. A traveler eating by himself in a corner might feel safe. A thief hiding stolen bread might not. Solitude changed flavor, made sweetness too sharp, made bitterness linger. Some foods were eaten raw. Apples, berries, nuts. Risky, but quick. Some were soaked. Lentils, beans, hard grains. Some were beaten, ground, crushed into pastes or powders. None of it was fast. All of it was work. Even the act of eating could be tiring, but no one complained. Not aloud. The act of feeding others mattered. A mother handing a child half her bowl. A neighbor bringing broth to a sick friend. A stranger leaving a crust by a door. These gestures were not grand, but they were remembered because kindness, like hunger, left a mark. Food brought people together, but it could also keep them apart. A noble's feast was guarded. A servant's portion was measured. A beggar's plea might go unanswered. And still, the hunger was the same. The body didn't care about titles. It asked only for bread, warmth, and time. Peasants told stories of magical kitchens, pots that never emptied, tables that fed all who sat, loaves that multiplied with every slice, not to mock the rich, but to imagine a world where food wasn't weapon or wall, where a full stomach wasn't proof of power. Salt was precious, carried across long roads, traded in lumps, flakes, stones. It preserved meat, flavored broth, sealed wounds. A pinch was enough. A sack was wealth. Not everyone had it. Those who did guarded it. Those who didn't made do with smoke, vinegar, or nothing. Water was not always trusted. Wells went bad. Streams ran foul. Rainwater was cleaner, if collected right. Some boiled it when fuel allowed. Others mixed it with ale or wine, hoping to soften its danger. Illness came from water more often than meat. But no one could avoid it forever. Mills turned grain into flour, but not without tension. Millers were watched, often distrusted, accused of taking too much, of grinding poorly, of favoring the wealthy. Some claims were true. Others were just the cries of those with too little. The millstone turned, steady and slow, and the bread that followed was both blessing and burden. Nuts were gathered in autumn. Hazelnuts, walnuts, chestnuts, cracked by hand, roasted over fire, ground into meal, stored in sacks hung high to keep them safe from mice. A handful in winter was a joy, a reminder of the green world that once was, and might be again. Preserved meat was never truly safe. Even salted, even smoked, It aged fast. A bad smell warned the cautious. A strange color told the wise to wait. But hunger spoke louder than caution, and when a stew turned sour, it was often eaten anyway, with hope, with prayer, because the cost of illness was not just pain, it was time lost, work missed, a season undone by one bowl. In cities, food was louder. Sellers shouted in the streets. Fish flapped on tables. Chickens clucked from cages. Bread steamed from open stalls. Spices lingered in the air, mixed with smoke and sweat. There was more variety, more movement, more danger. A meal could be found faster, but spoiled just as quick. Street food fed the poor. Pies with mystery fillings. Broth sold by the cup. Roasted roots wrapped in leaves. Not clean, not fresh, not always safe. But warm, but fast, but enough. People ate standing, walking, waiting. Food became motion. Survival became habit. Taverns offered more. A bowl of stew, a crust with cheese, ale poured without pause. For those with coin, even meat. A place to rest, a place to speak, a place where no one asked questions. The fire burned long into the night, and the pot beside it never truly emptied. New things were added each hour. It wasn't about taste. It was about comfort. The rich dined behind doors. 3 courses, 5, 10, bread in baskets, meat carved with care, fruit peeled and sliced, wine poured by hand, dishes too fine to touch. Servants moved without speaking. Candles flickered. A dog waited under the table, knowing it would be fed better than many outside. But richness had its own risk. Spoiled food dressed in spices, overcooked birds, undercooked fish, imported goods that had traveled too far, sat too long. Illness didn't fear gold, and a full table could become a place of regret. A feast remembered not for its joy, but for who didn't wake the next day. Gardens in cities were rare, herbs grown in pots, lettuce in narrow beds, a single apple tree in a courtyard, enough to scent the air, enough to remind someone of fields left behind. Earth found ways to exist even among stone, and people found ways to make it matter. Food could be stolen, shared, traded, ruined, blessed. It changed with hands, with time, with weather, but always it returned, in pots, in baskets, in dreams, because no matter how the world shifted, the need to eat remained, and with it, the rituals, the risks, the quiet hope that tomorrow's meal would come. Feasts were more than meals. They were performances, a display of wealth, of generosity, of control. Tables lined with platters, dishes brought out one after another. Music played. People laughed louder than usual. A feast wasn't about hunger. It was about showing others they didn't have to feel it. But behind the curtain, servants worked in heat and silence, fires stoked high, bread turned, pies sealed, meat carved. Hands moved fast, with purpose, without thanks. A mistake meant shame. A burned roast, a broken jug, a dish late to the table. All noticed, all remembered. Leftovers weren't wasted, at least not always. Some went to dogs, some to servants. Some disappeared into pockets and cloth wraps. A slice here, a piece there. Enough to feed a family back home. Enough to remind someone that even in another man's wealth, scraps still had value. In rural homes, feasts were rare. But when they came, they were honest. A pig slaughtered, bread baked in batches, neighbors invited, ale passed in shared mugs, children underfoot. Laughter real, not practiced. The food didn't impress with size, it impressed with warmth. Meat was still a treasure. Chickens kept for eggs were only eaten when old. Goats were milked, not butchered. Cows, if they existed, were wealth too great to eat. But once in a while, a decision was made. A festival, a wedding, a need too large to ignore, and the animal was thanked before it was taken. People respected food differently then, not because they were wiser, but because they had less. Every crust held meaning, every grain a story. A meal wasn't just a task, it was a measure of the season, of the land, of one's own luck. Some kept journals of harvests, notes carved into wood or scratched on walls. When the rains came, when the blight struck, when the orchard bloomed. Not poetry, not stories, just facts. Because food was the first truth of every year, and as the seasons turned, as winter crept in again, people did what they always had. They salted, they dried, they boiled, they hoped, because no matter how much was stored, there was always doubt. In monasteries, meals were quiet, no talking, only chewing, only prayer, bowls passed with care, bread broken, not cut, water poured with steady hands. The rules were strict, the portions modest, but the food, when it arrived, was clean, simple, reliable. Monks grew much of what they ate, gardens laid out in rows, herbs lined in neat beds, bees kept for honey, chickens for eggs. Their lives were ordered, and so were their meals. Lentils, barley, root vegetables, soup more often than meat, and always gratitude. Visitors were fed as well. A bowl set aside, a place made ready, no questions asked, because to feed was sacred, a tradition older than any wall or scripture. Hunger had no rank, no robe, no title, and so every hand received something, even if it was small. In times of plague, this changed. Fear replaced welcome. Food was left outside doors, passed with cloth-covered hands, dishes not returned. Touch became danger, and meals, once shared, turned solitary, not from selfishness, from survival. Plague didn't care about wealth. It entered castles and huts, touched kings and beggars. But food changed as it spread. People avoided meat, claimed garlic could protect, drank strong wine instead of water, burned herbs in rooms where no one slept, hoping smoke would keep death away. Families grew quiet, meals shorter, prayers longer, empty chairs too many. Stories of feasts faded, only recipes survived, passed in whispers. This herb helps the chest. That root keeps the fever low. Eat nothing sweet after sundown. Drink broth with onions before sleep. Markets emptied. Taverns closed. Bakers stopped their fires, and still, people tried. A mother boiled broth from bone and bark. A father walked miles for apples not yet picked. A child chewed hard bread while watching the street for anyone left. Because even as the world trembled, the body asked for food, and even in fear, people answered, not always well, not always safely, but with whatever they had, a bowl, a root, a crumb. When the plague passed, the world did not return to what it was. Too many were gone. Fields lay unplanted, markets quiet, tables fewer, but the hunger remained, and slowly the pots were filled again. A turnip boiled, a crust softened in broth, a sign that life, though thinner, had not vanished. New hands learned old tasks. Children took up plows. Widows baked alone. Recipes were remembered, if not perfectly. A pinch here, a guess there. Food became not just a need, but a thread. Something to stitch the torn world back together. Animals were harder to find. Herds lost. Coops empty. So people turned again to what grew quickly. Peas, beans, cabbage, things that asked little and gave enough. Every patch of soil was used. Ditches, corners, rooftops. Wherever sun could reach, a seed was pressed into dirt. Foraging returned, not as choice, but as habit. Berries picked with stained fingers. Leaves tasted cautiously. Roots dug with care. Not all were safe. Not all were known. But with each trial came knowledge. This bark boiled into tea. That nut roasted before eating. Mistakes taught. Slowly. Salt was worth more than ever. A single sack could trade for tools, cloth, even animals. It preserved meat, yes, but it also preserved hope, because salted food lasted, and anything that lasted was valuable in a world where little did. People remembered who had helped, a neighbor who gave flour, a priest who shared cheese, a stranger who left apples at a door without knocking. These moments were written nowhere, but remembered everywhere. Stories told not with pride, but with quiet respect. Feasts returned, though smaller. A pot of stew, a round of bread, a song sung softly. No grandeur, no show. Just food and presence. Just the sound of spoons and bowls and laughter trying to relearn itself. Even grief, when shared with warmth, could be softened. And so, hunger changed. From sharp to steady. From wild to familiar. A companion, not a curse. Something to live with, to respect, to answer again and again. Each meal a small victory. Each bite a memory. Each shared crust a promise that the worst had passed. Years passed. Crops returned. Children grew. Fields filled with wheat, barley, rye. The market noise came back, slow at first, then full again. Smoke rose from ovens each morning. The scent of bread returned to streets and homes. Hunger never vanished, but it stepped back, watching instead of chasing. Some things were different. People grew cautious, stored more, wasted less. Meals were still shared, but eyes watched more closely. Trust was measured like grain, slowly, carefully, because everyone remembered when there had been nothing. And memory had its own hunger. New recipes appeared, not from invention, but from necessity. A broth made with dried roots, a cake without flour, a pie thickened with crushed seeds. These became normal, not signs of poverty, but signs of endurance. People survived by bending, not breaking. Food bent with them. Children asked questions. Why do we save crusts? Why do we plant onions near the fence? Why do we eat stew so often? And the answers came, soft and patient. Because that's how we eat. Because that's what grows. Because that's what fed us when nothing else would. No fear in the words, just truth. Weddings were held again, and with them came tables of food, not endless, not grand, but enough. A roasted bird, a loaf for each guest, apples sliced and passed around. Each bite held meaning. Each sip of ale remembered those not present. Every toast, a thread between past and future. The old told stories, but they no longer needed to warn. Their tales were not of plague, famine, fear. They were of planting, sharing, rebuilding, of meals cooked over coals, of bread carried across miles, of a neighbor's soup that tasted like hope. Their voices were slow, but steady, like the turning of a millstone. And so food remained what it always had been, a sign, a signal, a story. In each bowl was history. In each crust, a choice, to hoard or to share, to remember or to forget, to fear or to hope. Because in the end, food was not just for the body, it was for the heart, for the memory, for the quiet truth that tomorrow could still be warm and full and kind. But not everyone stayed home, even after the fields were green again and towns filled with noise. Many still left. Not for greed, not for pleasure, but for need, for faith, for safety. The road called to those who searched, and to those who could no longer remain. Pilgrims walked toward shrines. Merchants traveled to markets. Peasants moved in search of land. Refugees fled from war. They were different in purpose, but alike in struggle. The road was long. Hunger was constant, and each day held risk. Food on the road was different. Not warm, not fresh, but light, dry, hard, flat bread, aged cheese, dried meat if it could be spared, nuts, berries, water in leather flasks, sometimes honey, often nothing. Meals were wrapped in cloth, tucked into belts, rationed, not eaten all at once, because no one knew when the next stop would come, because even crumbs held value. Pilgrims relied on kindness, alms from strangers, a bowl of soup from a monastery, a crust from a farmer's wife. Some found warm bread, others found locked doors and cold stairs. Not all believed a poor man walked with holy reason. A few carried small pots, hung from belts or packs, to boil porridge over a fire. But fire invited more than warmth. It brought eyes, people, wolves, thieves. So meals were eaten fast. Flames watched. Ash scattered when done. Shelter changed how food tasted. Under a roof, even stale bread seemed softer. In rain, Even fresh cheese lost its joy. Travelers ate where they could, beneath trees, behind stones, in ruined barns. Some made lean-tos from branches. Some slept beside roads with only a cloak and the stars. Inns were rare, expensive, often full. A place with warm food and a straw bed cost more than most could pay. And even then, the stew was thin, the bread old, the beer sour. But the warmth mattered. The fire mattered. The chance to rest one's legs and hands and mind. Not all inns were safe. Some robbed their guests. Some served meat gone bad. Some gave strong drink to dull the senses. And in the dark, coin disappeared. People disappeared. Food, once again, became a gamble. Many brought herbs, not for flavor, but for safety. Leaves to chew before drinking water. Roots to boil if meat smelled wrong. Travelers learned what helped and what harmed. A bitter taste could save a life. A sweet one could end it. Wild food filled gaps. Mushrooms after rain. Dandelion leaves in spring. Berries in summer. Chestnuts in autumn. Not all knew what to pick, and mistakes were silent. A wrong mushroom did not shout. It waited, quiet, deadly. The wise asked before they gathered. The others simply hoped. Some roads had shrines, small stone shelters with candles, carvings, and sometimes food. A bowl of apples, a loaf left by a grateful traveler. Not common, but not forgotten. These places fed more than the stomach. They fed trust. Horses needed feeding too, and they ate more than people. Oats, hay, grass if the road allowed. A weak horse meant walking. A dead horse meant stopping. Many journeys ended not in failure, but in stillness, because the food ran out, because the body refused to go on. And still, people walked, day after day, mile after mile, with little more than hope and the wish that tomorrow's meal would come. Some travelers begged, not proudly, not loudly, just enough to be noticed. A hand held out, a few words, a look. Most passed by. A few stopped. A coin, a crust, a nod. And then the silence returned, because no one liked to think they might be next. Others earned food through work. A day in the field for a bowl of stew. A fence mended for bread and onions. A song sung in the square for ale and porridge. Travelers became more than wanderers. They became helpers, guests, even teachers. But only for a while. The road always pulled again. Illness followed travelers. Tired feet brought infection. Dirty hands touched food. A single cough passed through a village. And sometimes a traveler was blamed. Not for what they did, but for what arrived after them. The fever, the death, the misfortune. Bread was not always welcome in foreign hands. And yet, some towns welcomed strangers, set out bowls, opened doors, not because they were rich, but because they remembered a time they had wandered, a time they had knocked and hoped. Food was not just a gift. It was a memory passed forward. Children watched travelers with wide eyes. Who were they? Where had they been? Did they have stories, coins, sweets? But most had only dust. only tired shoes and tighter belts, and sometimes a smile. Because even if the bread was dry, it was shared. Weather changed everything. Rain ruined fires. Wind carried away warmth. Snow buried paths. In winter, food froze in pockets. Fingers numbed before the crust could be torn. And in summer, meat spoiled fast. Water turned warm. Hunger grew in all seasons, but the cold sharpened it most. And still, a bit of stew in a wooden bowl could feel like a miracle, even if it was thin. Even if it was shared by many, the warmth moved deeper than the stomach. It touched something older, the part that remembered what it meant to be full. Some food was meant to last. Hard biscuits, salted fish, dried fruit. Not soft, not pleasant, but strong against time. A biscuit could survive weeks. A dried plum could soften a bitter mouth. These were packed first, eaten last, because fresh food vanished, and hunger didn't wait. Travelers learned to chew slowly, not for manners, but to stretch each bite, to feel it longer, to trick the body into believing it had more. A single slice of cheese could last an hour. A small apple could be cut into 5 parts, not because it helped much, but because it helped enough. People shared when they could. 2 strangers on the same road might split a meal without names. One broke the bread, one poured the water, and they sat, backs to the wind, chewing in silence. Not friends, not enemies, just hungry bodies with a little less hunger for a moment. Some carried food for others. A mother fed her child before herself. A man carried dried meat for a sick wife behind him. A brother saved the last crust for his sister's weak hands. These small acts were quiet, but they carried more weight than coin or sword. Wolves knew the smell of food. Bears, too. Fires were signals. So was the scent of meat. Travelers kept knives close, ate quickly, threw scraps far from where they slept. But fear stayed near, and many closed their eyes each night, not knowing if they would open them with a full stomach, or at all. Food was not the only need, but it was the one that returned most often. It knocked at the ribs, pulled at the limbs, slowed the steps. It made minds dull, made tempers sharp. Hunger changed how people saw the world. A kind word could taste like soup. A cold glance could feel like a closed door. Yet, with all its weight, hunger also taught patience, made people grateful. A crust was not just bread, it was survival. A bowl of broth was not just hot water, it was mercy. And in a world that moved fast, food slowed things down, made people sit, made them pause. Because in the end, every road led to the same truth, the need to eat, and the hope that someone, somewhere, had something to share. Roadside food was never planned. It was found. A patch of wild onions, a rabbit caught by chance, a handful of berries beside a stream. These moments felt like blessings, not from heaven, perhaps, but from the earth itself. And those who received them gave thanks in silence. Some learned to trap. Simple snares set at dusk, checked at dawn. Few succeeded. Most returned empty, but once in a while, a bird, a squirrel, a hedgehog, skinned with care, roasted over weak flames. Not much meat, but enough to change the day. Water mattered more than anything. Clean water, rare. Rainwater caught in cloaks, streams tested with a fingertip and a prayer. A drink too fast could bring sickness. Too slow could bring faintness. And when water ran out, nothing else truly mattered. Bread carried from home grew hard, days in a satchel, weeks in a pouch, but still eaten, soaked in broth, chewed slowly, broken with stone. It held the taste of where one had come from, of kitchens left behind, of hands no longer near. Some travelers cooked together, a shared pot, a small fire. One brought onions, one brought grain, one added herbs, and what came from it was more than food. It was proof that even in motion, people could belong, could gather, could create warmth. Old travelers passed on lessons. Never eat what birds avoid. Smell twice before you swallow. Save a crumb for morning. Their voices cracked, their steps slow, but their knowledge fed more than mouths. It kept others walking. Thieves watched for food, not gold, not tools. Bread in a bag, meat on a belt, a bulging pouch meant a full stomach. And a full stomach meant someone would fight to protect it. Fights broke out not for pride, but for apples, for roots, for crusts. And still, most held on, to kindness, to caution, to hope, because for every thief, there was a hand that offered. For every night of hunger, a morning with steam in the air. Meals changed with the land, in forests, roots and mushrooms, in mountains, goat's milk and dried meat, by rivers, fish if the net held, on plains, wild herbs and rabbits. The road offered little, but it offered differently with every turn. Some carried spice, not for taste, but for safety. Salt to dry meat, vinegar to soak greens, a pouch of crushed herbs to cover the scent of old food. These were treasures, kept dry, kept hidden, a pinch used only when needed. They made the unclean seem edible. Sometimes, they even made it true. Markets were moments of relief, a coin traded for stew, a stolen hour beside a warm stall. But markets were not free from danger. Pickpockets, guards, suspicion. A traveler with dirty boots and a dry tongue was not always welcome. So food, even when close, was not always reached. Beggars gathered at the edges, not just for coin, but for smell, for hope. A merchant's leftover, a child's dropped crust. The moments after a market closed were quiet, but not empty. Hands moved fast when no one watched. Some towns had rules. No feeding strangers, no begging on roads, no loitering by ovens. But people bent rules when eyes turned away. A woman slipped a biscuit into a cloth. A baker dropped crusts into a bucket meant for pigs. Not kindness exactly, just memory, because they had once been hungry too. Travelers learned the value of quiet. Loud hunger brought attention. Quiet hunger brought survival. Those who asked too often were pushed away. Those who waited might be fed. The difference was thin and often unfair, but it was real. And still, Even in these hard places, stories were shared. Of a village where bread was always warm. Of a spring that never dried. Of a monk who fed every traveler without question, true or not. These stories gave feet reason to keep moving. Because sometimes, the promise of food just ahead was enough to walk another mile. Food on ships was worse. Salted fish, dry biscuits, water in barrels, dark and stale, meals taken standing, swaying with the sea. Bread turned to stone within days. Meat crawled with life before a week. And yet, the sailors chewed, because the sea gave little and took often. Storms ruined stores. Rats chewed sacks. Fire sometimes found the galley. Then came hunger. True hunger. The kind that made men stare at ropes and wonder if they were edible. That made them dream of apples, of warm stew, of even the worst tavern broth. Travelers by sea packed carefully, dried fruit, smoked meat, jars sealed with wax. Most didn't last. Mold came fast. Rot came faster. And still, they tried. Because the ship moved far. Because the journey was long. Because the next dock was never promised. On land, food could be searched for. On sea, it could only be stored. Each bite was a countdown. Each missing loaf a reason for fear. Hunger had no place to hide at sea. It stood on deck and waited. River journeys were better. Stops were possible. Fishing helped. Towns passed. But floods ruined supplies. Bandits watched from trees. And even there, food was still a risk. A spilled crate. A spoiled bag. And the day changed. Hunger changed people. Turned voices sharp. Made friends into strangers. Men once generous grew silent. Women once smiling grew cold. Because food was not just survival. It was peace. And when it left, so did calm. Some ships rationed carefully. A crust at dawn. A sip at dusk. Shared in silence. Watched closely. And in that watching, discipline lived. Those who ate more than their share faced more than hunger. They faced anger, fear, punishment. But sometimes, a ship reached shore, a basket lowered, a crate lifted, and with it, new smells, new hope, fruit that dripped, meat that steamed, bread still soft. And for a moment, mouths remembered what joy tasted like. Not all journeys were by road or sea. Some crossed deserts, dust in every fold, heat in every breath, food wrapped tight against sun and sand, water more precious than gold, a sip measured in heartbeats, a mistake measured in graves. Bread turned dry fast, meat cured with heavy salt, dates packed in clay pots. Travelers walked early and late, avoided midday, rested in shadows when they found them. And even then, the hunger came, slow, dry, heavy. Oases were treasure, a spring behind reeds, a cluster of palms. Sometimes a goat, sometimes figs, but not always. Sometimes only dry wells and broken stone. And so they moved again, one foot after the other, with less than before. Camels carried food, but they needed it too. Grass, if found, grain, if carried. Their groans told stories of heat, of weight, of roads too long. Some refused to rise. Some died, and with them went water. With them went hope. Sand ruined food quickly. Grit in every bite, in every drink. A date chewed slow became a stone. Teeth cracked. Throats burned, but still, people swallowed. Because they had no choice. Because stopping was worse than pain. Traders made lines across the sand. Caravans of spice, of cloth, of salt, and always of food. Not shared freely, not wasted. Each hand had its own pouch, its own rules. And each night, as stars turned above, the same rituals played out. Fire, pot, bite, silence. Some deserts had inns, low stone shelters, a roof, a well, a fee, a rule. Rest here, eat here, leave early. No one lingered, because the desert did not wait. It swallowed those who did. And when the edge of sand was past, when green returned, the first fruit tasted like magic. A melon split, a jug of cool water, a crust with soft butter, and even though the sand still clung to their clothes, their mouths knew something had changed. In colder lands, travel brought new dangers. Snow-covered paths, frost-stiffened fingers. Food froze before it could be eaten. Bread cracked like stone. Cheese turned brittle. Water turned solid. Fires were harder to start, harder to keep. And still, people walked. Meat kept longer, hung in packs, dried on the outside, raw within, eaten cold, eaten tough, but eaten. Fat was treasure, rendered and stored in cloth. It gave heat, gave strength. And when food ran low, it was the last thing touched. Soups were made in snow camps, melted ice, dried meat, crushed roots, boiled slow, shared fast. Hands hovered near steam, faces leaned close, and for a moment, warmth returned, not just to the body, but to the spirit. Footprints marked the snow behind them, trails easy to follow. Bandits knew this, wolves too. Food made travelers targets. A loaf meant danger. A fish meant risk. And so fires were made low. Meals were quiet. Eyes stayed open longer. Some built snow walls, windbreaks, dug pits to cook beneath the surface. Clever hands could make a stove from stone and ice, and in that pit, even a thin stew tasted rich. Because it was hot, because it was safe, because it was now. Frozen rivers were roads, slippery, treacherous, but fast. Some travelers slid across with sleds, food packed tight, fingers wrapped in wool, but a crack in the ice meant more than cold. It meant loss. A whole winter's store sinking in silence. Villages in the north were guarded, guests questioned, food rationed. But once accepted, the hospitality was deep. Thick stews, dense bread, mead warmed near the fire. Songs hummed more than sung, because lips were busy chewing, because warmth was rare. And when travelers left, they carried more than food. They carried the memory of warmth, of safety, of a room without wind, and that memory fed them more than bread on the next frozen road. Not every journey ended where it began. Some travelers stayed, found a village, found work, found bread warm from an oven, and hands that passed it freely. Others kept moving, never sure why. Perhaps the road became home. Perhaps the hunger was not just in the belly. Those who returned brought more than stories. They brought recipes, ways to stretch flour, ways to boil roots, spices unknown, seeds tucked in cloth. They brought caution, too, which leaves to avoid, which mushrooms to fear, which fish turned bitter after rain. Food, for them, was not just memory. It was lesson. It was language. A stew told of the road, a biscuit whispered of frost. A slice of salted meat remembered the sea. Each meal was a page, each kitchen a library. Children listened, watched, helped stir, helped grind. They learned without knowing. That food took time. That warmth came from more than fire. That hunger taught as much as books. That a shared crust mattered. And the old, who once walked roads with empty hands, now filled tables. Slowly, carefully, not with wealth, but with care. A spoon laid just so, a loaf sliced in quiet, a pot stirred long. They didn't speak of the hunger unless asked, but it lived in their fingers. Season after season, the patterns returned. Plant, harvest, preserve, share. And in each act, the past stood close, not to frighten, just to remind. That food was never easy, that every bite had cost, and that to eat in peace was no small thing. Pilgrims still walked, traders still crossed borders, peasants still fled storms and kings, but wherever they went, food met them, in a bowl, on a stone, in a stranger's hand, and through it, the world softened, just enough, because in every time, in every place, in every hunger, there was one truth. Food was never just food. Today, most of us no longer walk for days in search of bread. We do not trade salt for meat or fear water from a stream. Our food is close, warm, varied, and yet we often forget how precious that is. The people of the past knew hunger well. They learned to be grateful for crumbs, to share soup with strangers, to boil roots into meals. For them, food was never just comfort. It was life and death. Let us remember this. Let us eat with care. Let us not waste what others once prayed for. Let us treat each meal as something sacred. In a world full of choice, health begins with what we place on our plates. Respect your body. Feed it well. Because food is not just about taste. It is about strength, about clarity, about the quiet promise that tomorrow can be met with energy and peace. Good night.